Well, today's subject is one of those, hazard communication. Now, safety people, in particular OSHA, is not really good at branding, right? We don't sell very well, and hazard communication is a terrible name because nobody knows what it really is. And so let's just define that to start with, that hazard communication is about chemical safety. It's about knowing the hazards that chemicals that you work with face, what they you face when you work with those chemicals. So pretty bad branding for that, but an important subject, an important thing that all of us should know and to keep us safe. All right, so I'll start off with a question. How many of you out there remember the 80s? The 80s, that was a great decade. That was like the pinnacle of music, right? Music went along and it got better and better and better. And after the 80s, it's just gone downhill ever since. Um, so that was a great time. We didn't care about a lot of things. We were pretty free and easy in the world in the 80s. We were just worried about getting nuked. Well, there were some things that free and easy attitude was probably not so good. In the 80s, your employer didn't have to tell you what kind of chemicals you're working with. Your employer didn't have to tell you anything um, of what the hazards of those chemicals were. They could just give you a spray bottle and a rag and say, go spray this stuff on that machine and wipe it down with that stuff. I know it stinks, just get to work. And that was really okay. There was no law around it. Um, and so it placed people in danger. We had a lot of hazardous chemicals used throughout our industries back then that were pretty nasty, some nasty carcinogens and all of those things. And so that was kind of scary. Well, along came the 90s. What happened in the 90s? Well, OSHA passed what they called the Hazard Communication Standard. It gave employees a right to know what chemicals they work with and what the hazards are for those chemicals. The goal was to reduce injuries from exposure to those chemicals. And so what chemicals were part of that? Well, anything that was deemed a hazardous chemical at 1% concentration or 0.1 concentration if it was a carcinogen. And it included a lot of things from acids and bases to disinfectants to solvents to cleaning agents and paints and you name it. If it was hazardous at all, it was involved in the program. So what did we have to do? Well, as an employer, we had to provide training to our employees. This is what you work with. These are the hazards that are associated with these chemicals. This is how to protect yourself. Here is an MSDS. We call them SDSs in these days. They used to be called Material Safety Data Sheets. And here's a piece of paper that tells you the various hazards of the product that you're working with. Well, MSDSs were not nearly as good as the SDSs we have in today's world. In the old days, they could be a 1-pager or they could be a 20-pager, and they weren't consistent, and you had to jump all over the place. One other thing that we had to do with the 1994 Hazard Communication Standard was label our chemicals so people knew what was in that container. Even if I took something out of a 55-gallon drum and put it into a spray bottle, that spray bottle had to have a label on it. Well, since 1994, the Hazard Communication Standard has been number one or right about number one on the most cited standard by OSHA. When I say cited, that means that employers get citations and fines and all of those things for not complying with this standard. So it's a tough one to deal with. It's an easy one to be out of compliance on, because if I take that spray bottle and put a chemical into it and I don't slap a label on it, I'm out of compliance. If I buy a new product at the hardware store and bring it back to the shop and I don't get a safety data sheet for it, I'm out of compliance. If I don't update my list of chemicals when that new chemical comes in, I'm out of compliance. So there are a lot of things that can put us out of compliance there. The question is have we done the things that will help all of us be safer in working around chemicals? So fast forward a little bit to the 2010s. What did we accomplish in the 2010s? Well, not very good music, I'll tell you that. But what we did accomplish was world peace. Well, as close as we've ever gotten to it, as close as we've ever gotten to world peace. And that's when the US joined the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. What was that I said about branding and safety people? We ain't very good at it. Um, so what we did is OSHA adopted the UN, United Nations, system for identifying chemicals. That's labeling and the classifications of different chemicals. Well, in doing so, we changed a right to know what the hazards are to a right to understand what the risks really are to us. It made some fairly major changes to our hazard communication standard. We have to it became a global standard, which is awesome because a company producing a chemical in China or somewhere else around the world might have to produce 16 different SDS sheets, MSDSs prior to being compliant with a lot of different countries around the world. And so with the globally harmonized system, that all went away and we standardized the safety data sheets. MSDSs became SDSs and they're standardized and the same sections apply in each SDS. So if I want to compare two chemicals, flashpoint, I go to the same section in those two SDSs and I can compare them side by side. The way we author those things has changed significantly as well. A lot of detail went in there. We identified hazards, and we'll talk about those in a minute, both physical and health hazards that can cause us harm. And we really redefined how employees need to be trained on this. Well, guess what? Fast forward to the 2020s, and we've got a new standard again. Well, not a completely new standard. OSHA has just announced that they have adopted the GHS Rev 7. Actually, the UN's on Rev 9 now, but we're catching up. And effective July 19th, we need to have this in place. Now, in truth, this will have little effect on most employers and employees. There are some definition changes. They want us to look at reasonably anticipated use, not just how the chemical comes in, but how are we going to use it? And if we use it in that manner and it changes form and it makes it more dangerous, well, we need to reflect that in the information that we're sharing with employees. So that's a major one. There were some label changes. One of those was on small containers, that if you're under 3 milliliters, then you don't have to put the whole label on there because it's really, really small. And then they tried to make sure that this standard was congruent with Department of Transportation, the labels that we put on when we're shipping a chemical from one place to another. I know that's a lot of boring stuff, but that's really where we're at. And I know some of you out there came for that update on what the new requirement is. Compliance date on that is in 2026. So we have a little bit of time, even though it's effective on July 19th of this year. And Mike, if there's any questions, just go ahead and shout those out at me as we go along. If not, I'm just going to keep burning through this.
Yep, keep burning. We're good.
All right. So what is HAZCOM? That's we shorten hazard communication down to HAZCOM. What's it all about? Well, it's really about chemicals. Chemicals are all around us. I have some chemicals in. I got a little mixture of root beer and Dr. Pepper this morning because the Gatorade was out in the machine. So there are chemicals in there. Stuff that we work with every day are chemicals. Some are more hazardous than others, but all of them put us at some degree of risk, and we're responsible for watching out for our own safety. Chemicals can get into our body in various different ways. Here are the routes of entry. Inhalation is really the primary route. If I breathe it in, it gets to my lungs, it gets to my bloodstream, and it can go anywhere in my body at that point. And then we have things like ingestion. A lot of times this is accidental. I'm working with a chemical and the brake bell rings, and so I get out a candy bar or a sandwich and start eating that without washing my hands or without using proper PPE before, and I ingest that chemical. Absorption through our skin. Some things can easily go through our skin, and so we have to be aware of that and keep those types of chemicals off our skin. And then there's injection. And you're like, what? Hypodermic needles? That's one way you can be injected, but other ways are things under pressure, like hydraulic lines or airless paint sprayers or other equipment like that that could inject a chemical in through our skin, maybe into our bloodstream. It can be really dangerous. All right, so let's talk about, can any chemical be a poison? And the answer is yes. This really smart guy, he was the father of toxicology who lived a long time ago. His name was Paracelsus. He said the dose makes the poison. Even something as innocuous as water can be a poison to us if we drink too much. If I'm drinking water and I'm not eliminating it through the normal ways, I can mess up the electrolyte balance in my body to the point where I can tip over and die. So we got to know how much is too much when it comes to this. And that's the challenge, is where do we find that information? That's why we have our safety data sheets, is so we can look up what that means, what the hazard of this chemical means to us. And one other thing to pay attention to are acute versus chronic chemical symptoms or effects. Acute is something that happens now, right? If I spill battery acid on my hand, I go, ow, 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 and I run to the sink and I wash that stuff off because it's burning a chunk of my flesh away. But I could breathe that same sulfuric acid that's in a battery as part of my job working at a plating shop. If I'm in plating car bumpers or something, I breathe small amounts of that for 30 years and I could end up with lung cancer from it. So the same chemical can have both an acute and a chronic effect. The insidious thing about the chronic effects, and the picture here is of asbestos, is we may not know that the chemical is doing it to us until it's way too late. If I breathe asbestos when I'm a teenager or in my 20s, I might find out when I'm 40 or 50 that I've got mesothelioma or asbestosis lung cancer. Those are really scary. So we've got to identify what are these hazards and know what it is, so we minimize our exposure. So we don't get a surprise 20 years down the road that I need to call up one of those late night attorneys and see if I can get some money for my family because I'm going to die. All right. We talked about safety data sheets. These are important. We need to have one for every chemical that we have in our workplace. That could be a lot. I've worked in locations where we literally had thousands of SDS sheets, and it was a massive job just keeping those up to date. And as we would bring in new chemicals, getting the new ones before the chemical came in, and updating our list of chemicals. Well, safety data sheets are far better than they used to be. We have 16 standardized sections. These SDS sheets need to be accessible by the employee where the employee is using the chemical. So what does that mean for us? Well, if you're working in a shop, well, that's really easy. We hang a binder on the wall with all the SDS sheets and a list of the chemicals that are there, and employees have access to that. Well, what if you're mobile? I know a lot of you out there may be going out in vehicles doing jobs, and you're using chemicals to do those. You have a line break in a water pipe. You might use some chlorine material to put inside of that line to sanitize it after the line break. Well, I literally need to have that safety data sheet available where I'm using the product. So how do I do that? Well, you have some options. You can have electronic access if that's something that every employee has where they're at, or I may have to take it with me. Our mosquito abatement districts do a good job on this. They have binders in their trucks as they're out fogging or putting larvicide on. They have a binder in there with all the labels for the pesticides that they're using and an SDS sheet for each one of those. That's a good way to go, but we've got to look at that and make sure that they're accessible. Where do I get SDS sheets? Well, the vendor or the manufacturer has the obligation to give you one the first time you buy the product. After that, if you lose it, it's on you. You've got to go chase it down. It's far easier now than it used to be to find these things. You can simply go online and search for the product, but it has to be specific to that product. Now, they allowed us in this new change, going to Rev 7 of globally harmonized system, to have families of chemicals. So a paint manufacturer may have a family of paints that have all similar chemicals that go into those. And so they can list a family of different products on that. And so they don't have to have an individual SDS sheet for each one of those, but be really careful about that, making sure that we're covering each of the types of chemicals that we have. Ask yourself, when's the last time I looked at an SDS sheet? We have a right to know, we have a right to understand, but do we use that? Do we use use that access to make ourselves more safe in the workplace? All right, I'm going to go quickly because I know I've got a lot of stuff to cover here. Here are the different sections of the safety data sheets, and once again, they're standardized. So if you want to know the toxicological information, you're going to go to section 11 in every SDS sheet. All right. Like I said, you got to have a list of chemicals. So all the chemicals that are there at the first of that, and keep those things up to date. If they send out a new one, you want to replace the old one, but keep that old one. You can scan it, but we need to keep that really forever. 30 years past the date the last person that used that was using that, or since they left the organization. So a long time. Let's see. I think we covered all this. Employees need to be trained on the hazards, and so we should do that each year. Train each for employees. I always like to have individuals pull out the SDS sheet for a chemical that they use and give a report on it and say, here's the chemical, here are the hazards, and here's what we do to make sure that we're safe. That's a good way to learn. Okay. Written HAZCOM program needs to be written down. That's another easy way to get an OSHA citation, is to not have a written program. So make that available to employees. It basically says, here's how we're going to do it. Here's how we're going to train. Here's how we're going to label. And here's how we're going to make sure that we keep our inventories up to date. And that's really, really what we're trying to cover. Lots of templates available. I'm going to skip this one just in lieu of time. How important is labeling? Every chemical container should be labeled. What about I have a 55-gallon drum of some chemical and I pump it into a spray bottle? Does that spray bottle need to be labeled? And the answer is yes. So for secondary use containers, we need to have a label available for that. Here's one that I like. It covers all of the GHS requirements. I can just circle the hazards on those pictograms. I can write the name, the product identifier, and the signal word, and I can put all the information on that one label. So buy a roll of these and have them available for those secondary use containers. The manufacturer's labels are okay. If it's a new product and it has the manufacturer's label on it, great. It has all the information. How do we read those labels? Well, it's pretty simple. We go top to bottom. We have a product identifier, which is just basically the name of the product. So what is it? And then I move down and there is a signal word. What is it? How bad is it? They're just two different words, danger or warning. Which one's worse? Danger. Okay, so that gives us an idea of how bad it is. What is it? How bad is it? Then what's it going to do to me? There's a hazard statement. This stuff is going to burn your flesh off of your body, or this is something that will cause you to go blind, or something like that. What is it? How bad is it? What's it going to do to me? And then what do I do to make sure it doesn't do that to me? Or a precautionary statement. If you keep the lid on this stuff, it will not burn your flesh off. Store in a cool, well-ventilated space. Don't breathe it. Keep sparks away from this stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, what is it? How bad is it? What's it going to do to me? What do I have to do to not have that happen to me? Those are the order. Chemical labels are much easier to read. It's easier to find the information. And so familiarize yourself with that. We talked about different hazards. There are two different classes of three different hazards. Two of them are required under OSHA. Physical hazards and health hazards. The environmental hazards are part of the GHS program, but OSHA doesn't adopt that because they don't regulate the environment. That would be an EPA thing. Okay, physical hazards. Here's the big list, and like I said, we're doing a lot of stuff really quickly because we gave ourselves a half an hour to hit a topic that we should, by rights, at least do an hour here. So we're not going to go through every one of the physical and health hazards, but you should know what each one of these things mean for the chemicals that you use or come in contact with. So there are things on here like a pyrophoric. What does that mean? Well, that's a material that can burst into flame without a spark. It can just be exposed to air and catch on fire. Here's a list of health hazards. Oh, and just one common thing on this, we have these categories. The lower the number in these categories, the greater the hazard to you. So if it's a category 1 acute toxin, that's the worst. Okay, and on carcinogens, so if it's a 1A, that means it's a confirmed human carcinogen. So that's worse than something like a suspected animal carcinogen, right? And so the lower the number, the greater the hazard. We have pictograms, and you're probably familiar with these pictograms by now. There are 9 separate pictograms in the GHS system, or the hazard communication system, and they're designed to stand out. So we see those. Some of the pictograms are better than others. This one that we see here, I don't know. It's for a health hazard. I don't think it's a great pictogram, but we deal with what we got because we're working with on the world stage. They did give us a little bit of leeway in the new standard there for certain pictograms. If there is a DOT, Department of Transportation, a pictogram that's required, we can actually use that one. Health hazard, and we're still kind of sorting out the details on exactly what that means, but that's what it said in the new standard. This is a health hazard, and here are the list of hazards from that big list that we just looked at that would fall under this pictogram. Here's another one, flame. Now that's pretty easy, right? And the hazards. Corrosives. Now, this is something that we use on DOT placards. If you take a chunk of flesh out of your hand, well, that's a pretty good pictogram in mine. Flame over circle is for oxidizers. We have a cylinder. This is a compressed gas cylinder. Well, there are a lot of hazards that go along with that, but we know it's under pressure for sure by seeing that. Explosives is this pictogram. And then the smiley face guy, the skull and crossbones. This is for something that is toxic. And then we have the best pictogram of all that means not a whole lot, and that's the exclamation point. It's kind of everything else, but you can see the hazards that are there. Under the environment, here's the pictogram that we use for that. I think it tells a pretty good story. If it kills fish, that makes me sad because I like to catch those fish. Okay, so we've covered a lot of stuff and we're pushing up on time. As we get all this information, we need to use it to keep us safe. So there are certain things. Use your personal protective equipment, when the appropriate personal protective equipment, when you're handling chemicals. Do what it says in the SDS sheet. Do what it says on the container and your process that you're doing to protect you when you're doing that. Don't do dumb things like trying to siphon chemicals through a hose. That can kill you. Don't do things like mixing chemicals that don't mix. Make sure you clean out your pumps and your containers that you use to dispense or carry your containers around. Better yet, don't reuse containers when it comes to chemicals. Keep lids and caps in place on those chemicals so you're not breathing it. And two, so it doesn't come in contact with a spark or something and cause a fire or other hazards or spill. Certain chemicals don't get along with other chemicals very well. So segregate those chemicals where you store them. Keep incompatibles like bleach and acid or acids and bases away from each other. Keep oxidizers away from combustibles and especially from flammables. And we want to put our flammables in a flammable cabinet. This is a great chart because it says what can be stored with what. All right. I know we're really short on time. I want to be done by 8:30, but here's some common things that we see. Just not putting a label on a spray bottle. This even has a place where you can mark what's in it, and they haven't done that. Ask yourself, do I have an SDS sheet for every one of these chemicals? Uh, it's doubtful, right, that we're going to have that. And so take a look at those. Go look at that old container that's in your chemical storage, and go see if you can find an SDS sheet for it. Do an audit every once in a while to verify that we've got it. About things like this, does the fuel tank outside need to be labeled? And the answer is yes. Under the HAZCOM standard, all that needs to be labeled. About things like this, I didn't get my Gatorade this morning, so maybe I'll take a swig of that. Well, in truth, that's antifreeze that somebody had put into a Gatorade bottle, and it places a hazard. I knew people back when I was working in production plants, a metal fabricator. A guy took a 20-ounce Coke bottle and filled it up with cutting oil, set it on his workstation, then walked away. And his friend came along and thought it'd be really funny to steal his Coke and drink it. And so he opened it up and took a big slug of cutting oil. Well, he paid the price for being a jokester with a bellyache on that. Fortunately, it wasn't sulfuric acid or something like that. Don't reuse food containers for chemicals, and ensure that we have everything labeled what's in it. Storage, store it appropriately. Don't store it where it's going to be spilled. Keep it away from incompatibles. Things like gases, those need to be secured so they can't tip over and break off that valve. And other things that go along with chemicals. Make sure your eye wash station is accessible and that it functions. Flow the water in that station periodically so it doesn't get rusty. You don't want rusty, nasty water going into your eyes if you happen to ever get splashed with a chemical. Okay. Well, that wraps it up with what we're going on. Just folks, if you've got questions or comments, type those into the chat box as I hit this summary page. Make sure you've got a written program. Make sure that you have a list of your chemicals, that your SDSs are available to all staff that are using those chemicals. Make sure that we're following proper handling and storage procedures that we just talked about. Make sure your labels are in place on all containers, and all staff are trained. And this is something that we need to be doing on a regular basis. This changes often enough. I would recommend that you do that training annually, so we get everybody trained up each time. All right, Mike, we have any questions?
Nope, I don't have any questions. Looking good so far.
All right, very good. You're looking good out there. It looks like a beautiful day.
It's a gorgeous day. I should have brought my sunglasses though.
All right, folks. Appreciate everybody out there for all of your efforts to make Utah a safer place. If you have questions or comments, please talk to us. We're more than happy to talk you through questions that you have, and if you've got some concern, we can take a look at it in person as well. So appreciate all of your efforts. Go out and have a safe day.
Thanks, everyone.